In the process of powerlifting program design, I program volume first and intensity afterwards. If right now you're thinking, does it matter? Does it make a difference? My answer is yes. And in this video, I will tell you how and why this process is my preferred way of programming for powerlifting. Now, if you're new here, my name is Norman Chung and I've coached powerlifters to compete internationally for over a decade. Now, before diving into how I approach programming volume and intensity, it's crucial to define these terms for this video. First of all, what is volume? When I refer to volume, I'm talking about the quantity of repetitions in a training program. Now, this amounts to the total sets and the total reps. To visualize this, I think it's helpful to consider both metrics together. Some coaches like to solely rely on total sets, but for some lifters, that might not be enough. But considering total reps adds a higher resolution to the perspective of the program. In some resources, volume is conflated with tonnage, which is sets, reps times load performed. While this is a valid definition, for the context of this discussion, I'm separating the two to keep the focus clearly on the reps. So then, what is intensity? Intensity, on the other hand, refers to the workload relative to the athlete's 1 rep max. Whether you prescribe intensity using percentages, RPE, or even velocity-based metrics, the program ultimately operates at an equivalent percentage of a lifter's 1 rep max for any given session. Now, think of intensity as a description or prescription of the stressfulness of the training dose. It's fundamentally a function of neuromuscular activation. But what does that even mean? It means that the higher the intensity, be it RPE or percentage, you're really activating higher threshold motor units. In short, these are generally your type 2 muscle fibers that are responsible for most of your strength and size gains. So then let's look at the relationship between volume and intensity. Understanding the relationship between volume and intensity is key to programming effectively. Here are some important points. First of all, it's the inverse relationship. There is an inherent inverse relationship between what volume can be done at given levels of intensity. Now, this is simply because there's a trade-off with acute fatigue that the lifter needs to be able to recover from as they lift at higher intensities. For example, at 80% of a 1 rep max, an athlete might only be able to manage 7 reps in a set. Across a session, they may only be able to manage about 20 to 25 total reps at this intensity. On the other hand, let's say at 70% of a 1 rep max, they can perform more reps per set and more total reps within that session. And this fundamentally describes the trade-off between volume and intensity. The next one is the long-term changes. Over time, as lifters adapt and become more experienced, the adaptations changes an athlete's work capacity for any given percentage of their 1 rep max. And the volume and intensity required to elicit progress will increase to a certain point and can potentially decline past that point with advanced lifters. At the end of the day, these dynamics must be considered when programming to ensure sustainable progress without overtraining the athlete. So let's look at the prescription of volume and intensity. Now, when prescribing volume and intensity for a training block or mesocycle, I typically establish a specific value or range first. The best analogy I can think of for programming volume and intensity is driving a car. Volume can be analogous to the gear of the car. The gear, in this case, represents the volume. It sets the tone for the training period, much like a gear determines the car's speed range. When programming, choosing the volume first is like deciding which gear that you'll drive at with a specific training block. It establishes the overall workload potential. Generally, volume doesn't deviate much during a block, making it a logical first step in programming. I'll explain later why. Intensity is analogous to the gas pedal. It determines how much stress and progression that you drive through a training block. With the same gear, or volume range, the intensity progression, or how much you push the gas pedal, can be adjusted to facilitate the dosage to trigger adaptations and progress through a block. Just like you wouldn't slam on the accelerator immediately when driving, you want to ease into intensity progression so as not to risk overreaching too soon within a training block. So why I program volume first? Well, volume really influences the overall workload for the block and tends to remain similar throughout the block. This consistency allows me to be able to set a stable foundation before layering intensity progression on top. If the athlete is coming off from a deload or competition, it's going to be easier to start off with a level of volume that is similar to the later weeks, but with a lower intensity that titrates upwards. By programming volume first, I create a stable foundation for that training block. Intensity then becomes the driver of progression, fine-tuned to both the training dose target and recovery capacity. Just as a quick reminder, progression in this case is the increase in stimulus. Next one is avoiding aggressive variability in fitness and fatigue. I generally avoid using volume as a primary progression strategy within a block. This is because seemingly subtle variability in volume can lead to drastic increases in tonnage and fatigue, which ultimately makes fatigue management and monitoring long-term progress difficult. Let's break down an example. let's say you start off with week 1 at 3 sets of 5, which is 15 total reps. Now week 2, let's say you have a progression to 4 sets of 5, which is 20 total reps. That is actually a 33% increase in volume. Alternatively, let's say you start with week 1, 3 sets of 5 at 15 total repetitions, and you progress that to week 2, which is 3 sets of 6, which is 18 total reps. That is a 20% increase. Even a small progression like adding 1 rep to a single set is still a 6 or 7% increase. In contrast, intensity adjustments allow for smaller, more precise progressions, sometimes as little as 1%, which are more manageable for the athlete. Remember this, it's generally not the case that high or low volume training is inherently risky for injuries, but more so the spikes in training volume that is. When you give yourself such a big spike in training tonnage to the point of fatigue and overreaching, the level and duration of the deloading can be somewhat unpredictable, which is ultimately why having a set and stable level of weekly volume is a useful strategy from the strength performance perspective. Having said that, there are some situations where volume progression works. For example, returning from an injury where the amount of training volume that they were doing to recover from that injury may have dramatically dropped, then you may need to gradually dial the volume back up to what you were used to before. Another situation is where athletes bench press with much smaller absolute loads, where 2.5 kilo increment jumps are significant. So now that I've explained how I think about volume when it comes to programming volume for a block, how do I program intensity afterwards? So the first thing that I like to do is start with an intensity zone or range. We can establish an average intensity target or range when writing a training block. Once you have that target intensity or intensity range, we can then design the first microcycle. As we have established a volume that we are going to work at, we can then decide the average intensity of that first week. Generally speaking, it's useful to start with a lower average intensity in the first week, where you give yourself room to dial the intensity up as you implement progressions. This can also give you room to deload from the previous block if you need to, or start off at an easier level so you don't risk massive drops in performance if you're a little bit underconditioned. Then looking at intensity progressions through the block. Once you have started off with a block with a lower end of average intensity, you can then consider how aggressively that you want to dial up the average intensity of each subsequent week. When dialing up the intensity across the weeks, if you have a target average intensity, then you want to keep dialing up that average intensity of each week until the average intensity of the whole block matches your target average intensity, roughly. If you do not have a target average intensity, then you may want to consider dialing up the intensity until you can see clear signs of overreaching, where you may have up to 2 weeks of stagnant or decline in performance. Intensity progressions can happen incrementally through the block, either via percentage-based increases or even RPE adjustments. So I hope you guys found this video useful. If you got any other questions, please put in the comments below, and I'll see you guys on the next one.